Let's review the process as players join the game. First, a socket is created on the client. We're going to be using the class player local. So we create an instance of the player local class. That in turn creates a socket that immediately communicates with the server, and the on connection event is triggered. At this stage, the socket will have an ID which we emit back to the client, which responds to it using the event onSetID. So at this stage, our server socket has an ID and our client knows what that ID is. On the client, we're going to randomly choose a model. It could be one of many that we've got available to us. Here's a few. In this instance, we're creating the model Businessman, and it also takes a colour because it's got 3 different bitmaps that we can use as a texture. We then use this information with the FBX loader class to create a version of this model. And once the loader is completed and we have our object, we call the player method initSocket, which informs the socket what model we've used and what colorway. At this stage on the server, there are 3 other instances of sockets. There's one that's going to be a housewife, one that's going to be a beach babe, one's going to be a waitress. So we need to get that information back to our client. We do that by the setInterval method, where we emit the remote data. The remote data is simply an array that contains the ID of each of our sockets. Remember, we passed that ID from the server to the client. The ID of each of our sockets, the X position, the Y position, the Z position, it's headed in the Y direction, its pitch and bank, what model it is, and what colorway it is. So an array of these. So in this instance, there will be 4 in our array because the server emits all sockets, even the client socket. So once we've emitted this remote data, we've got a JSON object on the client that contains a bunch of IDs and a bunch of information about what those models should be, what colorway they should be, what position they should be at, and what orientation, and also what action they should be displaying. So at this stage on the client, where we only have the single local player, we need to start creating these remote players. On the client, there's a remote players array which contains the objects that are our players. Remember, each of our players is a class that contains information about that player. We also have an array of initializing players because it takes a little while for a player to be created. And bear in mind, this remote data is being received around 25 times a second because it's a set interval of 40 milliseconds. So we check our remote players array and we check our initializing players. So initially they're going to all go into the initializing players. Bear in mind the remote data would contain all of these, so we have to ignore our self, which we can do based on its ID. So once we've created all our players, our remote players array will contain all the remote players, and our initializing players array will be empty. And the remote data continues to come. But at this stage we've got all the remote players that we need. Suppose a remote player disconnects, then the remote data array will not contain the ID for this player. So when we come to review the remote data on the client, we'll find a remote player that's not in the remote data. In this instance, we need to remove that player from the scene and also remove it from the remote players array. Throughout the time that the user is playing the game, 60 times a second on the update method for the game, we're emitting an update, a packet of information, a packet of data about our player object. It'll contain the X, Y and Z positions, its heading, its pitch and bank, its action, etc. And we update that to the server, and on the server there is a matching on update event which will update the user data property for this particular socket with these values. And of course this is then used for all our remote players to update their position, heading and action. So that reviews the principle behind how we're initializing the socket on the server, how we're setting the information for it, and how we're using that information to create and delete players and update their position on screen, their heading, orientation and action. In the next video we'll review the code as to how that's done. This video is part of a Udemy course. To get the full course at a great discount, pull down the description and click the link.